I was brought here, not for anything to do with Scouts. I was brought here to deliver a stewardship sermon. Stewardship sermons are not always people's favorite type of sermons, which is one reason you bring somebody in to give them. But I know that, and so I have a way of making it as painless as possible. I'm just going to tell some stories. I'm just going to tell stories. I got 4 of them. I'm going to tell you 4 stories, and I'm hoping that one of them will kind of get to you. Different ones, maybe different people. First story, just a made-up fictional one. I call it the story of the baptism of the Gauls. Not historical, kind of like a medieval urban legend or something. But the Gauls were real people. They were people who lived in what's now France and Belgium, and at the time of the Roman Empire, they had been conquered by the Romans, and they never did take real well to being conquered. If you watch the History Channel, you'll be there were often Gallic uprisings. Anyway, some missionaries venture into this territory, and some of the Gauls become Christians. Now, as the story goes, when they would baptize the Gauls in a river or in a stream, they would go under the water with one arm sticking straight up in the air, like that, which just seemed like an odd custom, and the missionaries soon learned the reason for it. Because the next time a battle or a skirmish broke out, the Gaul would say, "This arm is not baptized." Because this was the arm with which he would wield his weapon. And he could ride off to slay his enemy with his unbaptized arm. Okay, it's kind of a silly story, but I use it to talk about stewardship because I realize a lot of people think stewardship is just sort of a fancy word for fundraising. I get why they think that, because it's often what we end up talking about. But it's not that. I like to say stewardship is about belonging completely to God. Stewardship is about getting completely wet. It is about taking a good look at ourselves and discovering what is it in our lives that we try to keep free from the influence of our faith. And then discovering what that is and just immersing it in the waters of holy baptism. So it's not just about fundraising, but it often is about money. And why is that? We know, we talk about stewardship in the church, at least most of you will know. We do talk about other things. We talk about taking care of the planet and taking care of our bodies and stewardship of our families and time and talents. But we always end up talking about money, don't we? We always do. Always end up talking about money. I think I know why. It is because in modern day America, money tops the list of things that many of us would like to keep dry. I picture these modern day American Christians going underwater with that outstretched arm, I guess. This wallet is not baptized. My credit cards, my cash, my checkbook, whatever. That's why we end up needing to talk about money in the church, to hold each other accountable, because we know the tendency to allow that one aspect of our life to somehow get kind of put aside where it's not influenced by our faith And we really do want to belong to God. We want to belong to God completely, 100%. That was the first story. Second story. This one is to tell you what a steward is. The word used to be a word. It's in the King James Bible, but it's kind of fallen out of use. A lot of people don't really even know what the word means anymore. So I came up with a story that tells you what it is, what a steward is. My wife and I, we like to travel. And when we travel, we usually get a student from the seminary to stay in our home and take care of the house and our 4 cats. This is typically a student who lives in a cramped dorm room and has an annoying roommate. And, we have a very nice middle-class home. It's filled with all kinds of nice middle-class things. And there is never any shortage of volunteers for students who would just love to come live in our home for 2 weeks and use all our stuff and, and take care of the cats. So not a bad job for the non-allergic. That person is what the Bible would call a steward. It's very simple. A steward is a person who lives in a place that they do not own and gets to use all the stuff that doesn't belong to them. And in return, they're expected to take care of it. That's what a steward is. So Jesus tells stewardship parables in the Bible. He has several of them. Man goes on a journey, and he leaves his servants, the stewards, in charge of the house or the vineyard or the farm or whatever it is. And then the man comes back from his journey, and we find out whether they've been good stewards or bad stewards. So far, all the students who've stayed in our house have been good stewards. What if we came back and found out that the student had thrown wild parties and, broken all our china and spilled wine on the carpet and left the poor kitties to fend for themselves? Well, that would be what Jesus calls a bad steward in his parables. It hasn't happened yet, so I don't have that to draw upon, fortunately. So, one point of all those stewardship parables that Jesus tells, and you'll hear them, you keep coming to church, they come up now and then, is simply this. Are we doing a good job of taking care of all that God has entrusted to us? Or could we maybe do a better job? That's a point. It's not the main point. And that's where my story might help you to get this. The main point is something else. What if my wife and I came back from our travels to discover that the student had changed the locks on the door and now claimed that it was his house? He said, "This is my house. I live here. Oh, this is my stuff. My TV, my bed, my sofa, my cats. It's all mine." Don't you see that that would be a problem on a totally different order? And that is the main point of all those little parables Jesus tells about stewards. The main point is not that our people do a good job or maybe they need to do a better job. The main point, Jesus says, the fundamental problem with humanity is that people don't know that they're stewards. They think they're owners. They think it all belongs to them. What belongs to you? Nothing. Job says, "I brought nothing into this world. I will take nothing out of it." Everything we have in this world, including our bodies and our minds and our souls, our friends and our family and our money, everything we have is a blessing, a gift from God. It's not ultimately ours. Everything belongs to God. Now, I got 2 more stories that are actually about giving to the church. You kind of knew I'd get there eventually. But they illustrate 2 different parts of giving to the church that I call duty and delight. two different reasons that people might have for giving to the church. They're both good. The first is about duty. I'm always a little uncomfortable telling this story because it's not as, the story I'll end on will be a happy one, so that'll be better. But this one is less happy. But I have told it before, and I hear back from people who tell me that had a profound impact on them. They'll say, I have never gotten that out of my head. A year later, that has changed the way I think and live. So I never know. Maybe there's one person here. I don't know. It's worth throwing it out there anyway. It's a true story. A guy I named Gary. Gary was part of a men's group that would get together every other week, every 2 weeks. He got together with some friends, and they would, let's say they would play Uno and drink a lot of Pepsi. They had a little table with some pretzels and chips and snacks on it, and there was a basket on the table. And so every 2 weeks, Gary would come there, and when he would leave, he'd toss $5 in the basket. He did this for, a year. And then one time as he was going, he tossed his $5, and he starts going out, and he looks back, and he sees a friend of his. A friend of his tosses in a $20 bill, and then opens his billfold and pulls out a 10 and a 5 and tosses those in. And they start going, $35. And so, as they're going out the door, Gary says, did you just put $35 in the basket? There's no way it costs that to buy those snacks. It didn't cost $35. I always just put in 5. And his friend said, I know. It's about $20 a person. So I put in 20, and then I usually put in another 15 because, you only put in 5. I didn't make up for you. That's what friends are for. So how did he feel when he learned that? It wasn't that he couldn't afford it. He could have easily put in $20 every week. He'd never thought about it. He'd never done the math. He had no idea what it cost. You can connect the dots to figure out what that might have to do with giving to the church. But the church has a budget, needs to meet, has expenses that need to be met. If everybody in the church does their fair share, and everybody doesn't give the same amount, of course. We give according to what our income might be and what our needs might be, and how many expenses and dependents we have. We get that. It's called proportionate giving. But if everybody gives what's sort of responsible for them, it works fine for everyone. But that almost never happens. In every congregation, there are people who do not give anywhere near what would be responsible for them. What that means, maybe you never thought about it before, is it means other people in the church have to make up for them. And they do, because that's what friends are for, and because people love other people and want to make up for those that don't do what they should do. I'm not hard on those people because I was one of them for quite a long time. My guess is many of you were too. It's rare that somebody's been a faithful steward or giver all their life. There's usually some learning curve involved. We've gone through times in our life where what we were giving was nowhere near what we ought to be giving. Thank God other members of the church cared enough about us and about the church to make up for us. But you might arrive at a point in life like when Gary all of a sudden realized, and you just don't want to be that person. That's giving as a matter of duty. I got one more story. It's a pretty quick one, and it's my favorite one. I bet it'll be your favorite too. Pentecostal pastor told me this story. And he said it's the difference between giving out of duty and giving out of delight. Both are good. Delight is better. He says, I grew up in a small town. When I was 8 years old, my mother sent me to the florist shop to get some flowers for the dining room table because we were having company. And so, I went and took the money and went and bought these flowers, and I'm taking them home to put on the table. I was 8 years old, and I remember very well walking down the streets of the town, worried that somebody would see me carrying these flowers. You think, why? Well, they'd say, "Where'd you get the flowers?" or something. Or they'd think I was a sissy because I was carrying flowers. Or look, it just doesn't take a whole lot to make an 8-year-old boy feel self-conscious. So, for whatever reason, he says, I didn't want to do it, but I did do it because I was an obedient child and I did what my mother had asked me to do. And that was the right thing to do. Sometimes, this pastor told me, that's exactly what giving to the church is like. You don't really want to do it, but it's the right thing to do. And you just do it because you should do it. It's our duty. It's my duty as a member of the congregation to support the congregation. And that's it. It's a good thing that people are willing to do what they ought to do, whether it feels good or not. But that's not all there is to it. 10 years later, he says, I wasn't 8 years old, I was 18 years old. And I was in love with a young woman who lived in this town. I had a part-time job, I got some money, and I went to the same florist shop, still there, and I bought her flowers. And I was taking them to her house to give them to her. And naturally, there's this kind of deja vu experience. Here I am, I'm walking down some of the exact same streets I'd walked down 10 years before, carrying this bouquet of flowers. But this time, I didn't think about what somebody might think of me if they saw me, or I wasn't worrying about any of that, because you know what? I was only thinking of two things. How happy she would be to get flowers, and how fortunate I was to be the one bringing them to her. That's the difference between giving out of duty and out of sheer delight. And that's really my hope and prayer for all of you. I hope that you know everything belongs to God and that we are just stewards of all the things that God has graciously, generously given to us. And I hope you're willing to do your duty and step up and support the congregation just because it's the right thing to do, whether it feels good or not. Sometimes we just all got to do that. But most of all, I hope and pray that you would just fall in love with God. And that when you come to this church with offerings to make, you would just think of these two things. How happy God is to receive anything that we are able to offer. And never forget how incredibly fortunate we are to be people making these offerings. Thank you. Amen. Wow, look at that.